Да.
Окей. Так. Готовы?
Да.
Окей. Ну, спасибо за приглашение и возможность рассказать немножко про Финляндию и тему миграции. Ну как, меня зовут Пол Фрайер, да, Фрайер, очень хороший Фрайер. Но я работаю доцентом в кафедре географии в Университете Восточной Финляндии, находится в городе в Йонсу, это маленький городок, 60 тысяч, это не как в Казани. Я уже 17 лет работал в должности там, но я сам не фин. Я трудовой мигрант, сам из Канады. Да, это правда. Я получил работу в Финляндии после аспирантуры. Я в аспирантуре кончил в Англии, потом получил приглашение в Финляндию и судьба моя. Сейчас я здесь, в Казани. Так, я работаю, научные интересы, теперь это все они все связаны с миграцией, но особенно миграцией, но здесь, в постсоветское пространство, я очень часто бываю в Киргизстане, Таджикистане и здесь, в России. Но, конечно, так надо сказать, что миграция в Финляндии – это не моя тема, но, конечно, я в курсе, потому что там я живу. И так, я могу представить ситуацию в Финляндии после кризиса с беженцев, который начинался как в 2015 году, летом. И, как я сказал сначала, все мои слайды на русском, наверное, есть ошибки, но что делать? Но если вы не против, я вступаю на английском, потому что, я не готов на русском. Okay, so again, thank you for having me here. So, the migrant crisis, or the crisis with refugees in Europe, which took the continent by surprise, has had a different expression in Finland, and that's largely due to Finland's particular position in the European Union. Okay? So, we don't have to explain the refugee crisis. Many causes of the crisis, of course, the instability in many countries of the Middle East and South Asia, namely Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, brought this incredible movement of people unexpectedly to Europe. And this caused great chaos in Europe. It's caused great debates in Europe. And for European society and governments, a lot of it has to do with what we believe Europe to be and to stand for. So many people in Europe who feel that we should be welcoming to the refugees talk about European ideals, our support of human rights, and this perhaps rather strange idea in Europe that we have a role, a global role, to provide moral leadership in very difficult times. But of course, on the opposite side, there is the economic realities of Europe after the 2008 global economic crisis. A number of populist and nationalist movements have grown, and a lot of anti-European Union rhetoric has also grown. And within these groups, we see the strongest opposition to welcoming the refugees. So, within this sort of framework, where does Finland stand? And that's a bit of the topic today. So, statistics, we know, are imperfect. We can only use statistics as a guide. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, they give these lovely statistics. So in 2015, over 1 million refugees or asylum seekers came to Europe. Greece receiving the largest group number, and the majority of those coming from Syria, while Italy and Spain, so the countries on our southern Mediterranean border, having the majority of the refugees arriving. But as you can see with Italy, the majority are not coming from the Middle East, but from sub-Saharan Africa, Eritrea. Now, after this huge spike in the numbers, in 2016 it's already fallen, but still Greece and Italy having the most refugees, Greece always having the majority from Syria, while Italy largely attracting those from sub-Saharan Africa, and not necessarily places with conflicts. In 2017 and the first 3 quarters of this year, the numbers again have fallen by about half. From last year, Italy is now the largest destination. Greece no longer being the primary or the first country of entering the European Union because of an agreement with Turkey, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now the migrant routes have shifted further to the west, to leaving from North Africa, especially from countries like Libya, which have their own internal problems. And a lot of the refugees or asylum seekers are now from African countries, and not so much from the Middle East. But these statistics are based upon those people who have registered. So we know that the numbers are much, much higher, because not everybody registers. But this is what we have to go on, and I think what's important is to see the trends, and also the largest groups. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, they're still dominated by asylum seekers from Syria or Iraq, while moving towards the Western Mediterranean, it's mainly asylum seekers. Largely, you could classify them as economic migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. Again, we have to remember during this whole crisis, and many people talk about this being a Syrian crisis, during the Syrian civil war. Europe is only one player, and many countries in the region have had felt a much bigger impact of the refugee crisis. So Turkey, until now, registers over 3 million Syrian refugees, Lebanon over 2 million, and Jordan 1.27. And the photo shows the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, which houses over 80,000 refugees, Syrian refugees. And of course, then we have to think about the eternally displaced persons, the Syrians who have been forced to flee from their homes but have remained in safe areas, if there are any safe areas of Syria. So about 6.5 million Syrians have been displaced and remain in Syria. So if we take these numbers, then the actual numbers who were fleeing to Europe, it's not so big. I mean, 1 million refugees to Europe with a population of 500 million compared to, poor little Lebanon with 2 million. It's the perspective, the proportions are not always remembered. Now the European Union has two agreements, two laws that deal directly with the crisis. So from 1998, there is the Dublin Agreement, and in 2001, the Schengen Agreement. And certainly any visitor to Europe probably knows about the Schengen Agreement and Schengen visas. The Dublin Agreement, it was signed at a time when the majority of asylum seekers or refugees coming to Europe were arriving by airplane. Arriving in the big cities of London, Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam. And the agreement really just stated that the country that is the first safe country reached by a refugee will be the one to process and accept or reject the refugee. So this made sense at a time when the majority of refugees were landing in the big, rich countries. Though the Schengen Agreement has been extended to non-European Union member states. So, for example, Norway and Iceland are also Schengen members. Switzerland was and then decided to pull out, and it's a bit complicated with Switzerland, especially when you consider it's right in the middle of Europe. But anyway, Schengen has meant not only for EU citizens free travel. We don't need to carry our passports when we go from one country to another. When we fly from one country to another, we just need our European identity cards. We don't need a passport. It's very quick, it's very easy, it's cheaper. But it has also meant that for anyone getting into the Schengen zone, such as the asylum seekers, there are no boundaries, there are no borders to stop people from moving from one country to another. Which meant during the early crisis that the majority of refugees, after arriving in Greece, started to move towards the north, to Germany especially, to Sweden, and other more industrialized, larger economic powers in the north, which caused some people to be very concerned, in some countries to bring back borders. Hungary being the main country that's tried to cut off the migrant route by putting up borders with Serbia, with Croatia, and so on. So the crisis, why do we have this crisis? Well, it's nice to say war, or not nice to say war, but it's easy to say that it's all because of war. Of course, it's largely a failure of the international community to work together to try and resolve a number of problems in the region. the geopolitical standoff between the Russian Federation and, well, I'll say the West, but maybe I say the United States. On the other side, certainly has contributed to this problem. And then other issues such as support for international terrorism, or at least the inability of the international community to deal with the sources of funding for international terrorism, and so on. So, for the European Union, this crisis has led to really the destruction or the collapse of both Dublin and Schengen agreements. Dublin still exists on paper, but the ability to enforce it has ended. Countries have adopted different policies towards the asylum seekers, and this has undermined the agreement. Schengen as well has been severely weakened. We do not have the full mobility border-free zone in the Schengen countries, so Sweden still has controls on its southern border, Denmark on its southern border, Austria, Croatia, Hungary, and this is really undermining one of the key policies of the European Union. And as I said, this crisis has really highlighted the differences in policy between the different EU countries, and we've especially seen a division grow between the, shall we say, the original, more Western European states and those in the new East Central European states, particularly Hungary and Poland, who have been very strongly opposed to any refugees at all. Now, of course, I'm skipping a lot of details. We don't have time to discuss all of EU refugee policy. But in the past 3 years, since the beginning, or almost 3 years, we've seen the decline. We saw some of the statistics. So there are fewer refugees coming. Part of this is due to this agreement of readmission with the Turkish Republic from 2016, last March 2016, which basically means that for Turkey's help in stopping the flow of refugees leaving Turkish shores, for Greece, that the EU will take a certain number of registered and official asylum seekers from the United Nations camps in Turkey. So this has made a huge difference in Greece. And it is part of the reason that there is a growth in the number of refugees in Turkey, because they're staying there. We've also seen a move, the migration routes have moved to the west, leaving from the largely ungoverned Libya, some Tunisia as well, Algeria, but largely from Libya going to Italy. Most of these are from sub-Saharan Africa. So people who may not be fleeing from violence, but rather are looking for better economic conditions. And And of course, the situations now in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, well, maybe not Afghanistan, but certainly Iraq and Syria, with the numerous defeats of the Islamist Daesh, or IS, IGIL, whatever you want to call them. With the defeat of these groups, there is more security in these countries, so the pressure for people to leave is less. And the EU, while we have very many problems, certainly Brexit being one of them, but on the other hand, the issue has the crisis has identified the weaknesses in policy, and the EU over the past couple of years has been working very hard to fix these weaknesses, to end the problems. So what we get is a completely mixed picture from Europe, pro-refugee movements, anti-refugee movements, rather poor. We see Greece with one hand refugees being given old ferries to be moved to parts of the mainland from islands, while others are being stuck in camps on the borders, attacks against refugee centers, and so on. It's certainly a very difficult time for Europe. Now, if we talk about Finland, I should talk about Finland. So Finland is a bit different. It traditionally has been a source of migrants. It's never really attracted migrants. So in the 20th century, over 1 million Finns have emigrated, mainly to the US and Canada, Australia, Sweden. And just as an example, not long ago, in 1960s to 70s, over 200,000 Finns moved to Sweden looking for work, and they didn't come back. So that was 1960s, 70s. This should be a time of prosperity in Europe. Well, not so much in Finland, which has always relied on natural resources for its wealth. It's only in the 1980s, early 1990s that Finland had its technological miracle led by Nokia. As a result of the Second World War, 12% of Finnish territory was ceded to the USSR as part of the peace agreement, and it meant that 420,000 Finnish citizens had to flee. They had to go and be resettled in other parts of Finland. So there is a history in Finland of integrating and accepting refugees. That was about 10% of the Finnish population at the end of the Second World War. So it has happened in the past, though of course they were Finnish-speaking refugees. Sort of the first the first outside refugees started coming to Finland in the 1970s. They were from Chile, from Vietnam, some other Southern American refugees, usually from leftist groups. The Vietnamese were largely sponsored by churches. They were Chinese, ethnic Chinese leaving Vietnam. They tended to be Christian, and the churches took a role, while Finland had not been. And so the other Nordic states put pressure on Finland, and in the early 1990s we saw Somalis arrive. And I've seen some photos of these first Somali refugees in the middle of January, arriving on an airplane and probably thinking, what hell had they been sent to? Because it was certainly a bit different from hot Somalia. So again, the numbers coming into Finland have been very, very small. Migration, sort of regular, normal labor migration, really has only begun with the European Union. So Finland joined the European Union in 1995. And after this point, Finland started to open up. So a few years ago, in 2014, there were just over 200,000 foreign citizens living in Finland. So about 4% of the population. But of those, about 60% were from other countries of the European Union. So the numbers we're talking about are very, very small. The biggest groups of migrants in Finland are from its neighbors: Estonians, Swedes, and Russians. Again, not a surprise. So Swedes and Estonians, of course, are European Union citizens. And in general, these European migrants have not caused any discussion in Finland. They tend to be well educated, or they've come from marriage or some other reason. It's just strange people like myself who have no ties to Finland who decides to take a job there. I am a freak. I should also say that the statistics in Finland, once somebody becomes a citizen, they no longer appear in the statistics. So the number of non-Finns living in the country is actually higher. So if you want to find out the number of migrants, then you have to look at, certainly you start with the statistics on citizenship, but then you're most likely to go to the statistics on mother tongue. So for now, it's been 6 years that I've been a Finnish citizen. I have dual citizenship. So now, in 2014, I am not counted in that statistic because I'm a Finnish citizen. But you would find me by looking at the statistics on people with English as a mother language. It gets very complicated. But it's important to remember this because many of the Somalis who came in the 1990s, they have Finnish citizenship. So they're no longer considered a foreigner by the official authorities. But for the majority of Finnish citizens, Somalis are still foreigners. Doesn't matter what the passport is. Now with the current refugee crisis, there was the following debate in Finnish society. So there were people who said, yes, we have to support them because we have in Scandinavia, in the Nordic states, this tradition, sort of a welfare state tradition to support those who are less fortunate, who need our help. This is fundamental in sort of the building of Finnish society. But on the other hand, Finland is pretty conservative. Most, except in maybe the large cities, the majority of the population have no experience of multiculturalism. They don't know foreigners, they've never met them. They don't really go abroad for holidays. They have a very small mind, or small worldview, not small mind, small worldview. And they're the ones who feel mostly threatened by the migrants. So, another issue for Finland was the election, the national election in 2015. And we brought a right-center coalition. Finland always has coalition governments. Usually we have very wide coalitions with parties from the left, from the center, from the right. But this was the very first time in our history that we had this coalition only from the right and the right center. And the three parties, two of them are very pro-European Union, and one is the populist, anti-European Union, anti-migrant party. And they found themselves with this problem. What position to have when two of the parties are pro-EU and supported EU policy on the refugees, while the other one didn't want to have anything to do with it. The populist party was the smallest of the three and was basically forced to adopt the official EU position. And the Finnish government's position is that it believes in the Dublin Agreement. So refugees, asylum seekers should be processed in the first country. And just, it happens that this issue has caused the populist party just this summer to collapse. It's split into two. And it's the populist movement in Finland is in quite chaos, which I think is a good thing, but that's me. If we talk about the numbers, 2015, about 32,000 asylum seekers came to Finland. Now if you think the 32,000, you think Germany, 1 million, it's not a lot. But then if you also looked at it in the previous year, Finland had 3,000, 3,500. So it grew by 10 times, which put big strain on Finnish government's ability to process the asylum seekers. Now for Finland, unlike other countries, the majority of asylum seekers have been from Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia. Very, very few Syrians actually came to Finland. In 2016, the number dropped. Only 5,500. Again, the numbers are about the same. Those are more Syrians. And of course, this is due to the fact that so many borders between Greece and Finland had been closed. Also the agreement with Turkey. Now the Finnish Red Cross had to step in to open reception centers because the Finnish government had a handful of reception centers for a few hundred people. We suddenly had 30,000 who needed to be housed, who needed shelter, who needed food. So eventually 94 were opened, largely through the Red Cross. These were opened all over the country, especially in small rural towns, where the support for migrants is lowest. The largest center, it was opened up here on the Swedish border in the town of Tornio. That's where the majority of the asylum seekers came to Finland, via Sweden. There was a rumor at the end of 2015 that Sweden would process asylum claims faster, that Finland would process asylum claims faster than Sweden, which is not true. But that was the rumor, so about 30,000 people came. So Finland, of course, has been dealing with the asylum seekers who arrived in Finland. Connected to the larger European crisis, Finland has agreed to take a quota of asylum seekers from other EU countries, largely Greece and Italy, over about 2 years. Now this agreement within the European Union about the resettlement of asylum seekers from the countries in the south to all across the European Union has been extremely controversial. And countries like Hungary and Poland have utterly rejected accepting any, which has caused countries like Germany and Sweden to threaten their membership, to say the least. Finland, it said that it would take a quota. It's supposed to be something like 10%? No, sorry, it can't be 10%. 2% of the total number. So it was agreed that Finland would get just over 2,000 resettled asylum seekers. In October 2015, 50 Eritreans were resettled. This discussion continues within the European Union. Finland has made its offers to take the Union. Not much has been happening. But these quotas from within the European Union are separate from the quotas that Finland has agreed with the United Nations. So the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, it has an agreement with Finland. We are meant to take 750 refugees from different parts of the world per year. In 2016 and including into this year, almost 1,000 refugees were resettled from camps in Turkey. They were largely Syrians. The government not long ago said that it was willing to raise the quota of resettled refugees from the UNHCR camps around the world. And that makes me wonder if this is a way of avoiding the European Union quotas. And you'd say, well, what's the difference? Well, when Finland takes this, well, when any country, it's not just Finland, when any country takes resettled or agrees to resettle refugees from the camps, they get to choose who comes. So they tend to choose the people who have the good education, who speak languages, young people with families, those kind of refugees. Of course, the number of refugees in the European Union, they represent people of all types, the old, the young, the educated, the uneducated. But it's interesting, and I don't really know why the government agreed to take, or has suggested it could take additional refugees when society is largely against it. That's our current Finnish president, who of course likes to pose for the cameras. So we have these asylum seekers, or refugees. How does Finnish society relate to it? Well, there have been some really good examples how the crisis has sort of reactivated Finnish society. When the refugees first arrived in 2015, there was a huge outpouring of volunteers, people who donated money and time and furniture and clothing. This sort of volunteerism hadn't been active in Finland for many, many years. There's been a growth of sort of participation in NGOs, in pro-migrant associations, and there have been a lot of people who have been protesting against racism. And unfortunately, the racism is largely a result of the migrants. So there are certain parts of Finnish society that are very much opposed. It would be, of course, not correct to generalize, though they tend to be in rural areas or amongst the working class. Finns do not like really being very confrontational. So most of this opposition has taken place on the web. So internet-based chat rooms, we've seen a huge outpouring of really ugly and nasty racist abuse. Of course, some of it does happen on streets, tends to be verbal abuse. There have been 2 attacks on reception centers. Most times alcohol is very much involved. Not that that's an excuse. Finland saw the growth of these informal protection groups. We had the Soldiers of Odin, which had some connections with other Nordic, I'll say right, maybe far right, but they were there specifically they grew up because of the refugees. Their stated mission was to keep the streets safe for ordinary Finns. But they were just a bunch of hooligans, in my opinion, who would walk around looking very bored and just be very aggressive. Largely male. These groups have largely died off now. But of course, opposed to them, we had groups like lots of women walking the streets. They called themselves the daughters of, if these were the soldiers of Odin, a Norse god, these were the daughters of Kuliki, which was from the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, who would go around and try to help any migrants. They gave out sweets and did whatever they could. And other groups that I think these were the clowns of Odin, and groups that basically followed the soldiers of Odin around and made fun of them and made sure that they didn't do anything terrible. So it created a lively sort of public debate and activated society. Now, of course the numbers have fallen. That's very important. So the issue is not as strong as it was before. As I said, a lot of these groups, they've sort of disappeared. These ones on the streets. A number of the reception centers have been closed. They've been consolidated. The attempts to integrate the asylum seekers have started. The numbers have fallen not just because of the external factors, like the Balkan route is closed, the agreement with Turkey, that's very important, but also factors that are due to Finland. Now, refugees, in refugee circles, in the countries of origin, Finland is not really seen as an attractive destination. because they did not find what they were looking for in Finland. The Finnish government stopped accepting Iraqis as refugees, and they were our largest group. The government said that most of Iraq was calm, so that difficult, and so on. Since 2015, there have been about 38,000 decisions on asylum. Now that number includes some people who had come before the crisis. So it's not just the ones who arrived in the crisis. You can't distinguish which ones. But they have been making decisions. And of those, 44% have been negative. So 44% of the asylum seekers have been forced to return. They have had their claim denied. Of course, many of those are fighting this in the courts, so they all haven't been sent home. About 28% have been positive, and those particularly from Syria. And then about 28%, these are the ones, some people have just disappeared. They've probably gone to Germany or somewhere. Some have removed or withdrawn their claims for asylum. They realize that they don't want to be in Finland. What they do afterwards is hard to say. And then some have accepted voluntary return. So they weren't rejected, they just decided to go home. So if you look at the statistics, Finland is not the most welcoming country for refugees. I'll just, on a couple of minutes, I hope I still have a couple of minutes. I don't know what time I started. So there was a very interesting situation that might be interesting for you. Everyone was looking at the Balkans and the refugees coming through Turkey, but there was another way that refugees were coming to Europe, and that was through Russia. It started out at the end of 2015 when some 5,000 refugees suddenly crossed the border from Murmansk Oblast into Norway. Yeah, Norway. Murmansk and Norway. I mean, the border is only like, I don't know, 50 kilometers long. It's tiny. And the Norwegians were suddenly overwhelmed. Where did all these refugees come from? Mainly Syrians. And it was to do with a hole in the Norwegian legislation, as I understand, that you could cross a border by bicycle. Because the refugees didn't have cars, and you couldn't by law walk over the border. But bicycle was enough. And I guess cheap enough to buy a second-hand bicycle in Murmansk and then cycle across. This is happening October, November, December. The Norwegians very soon closed the border, and that's when the refugees started moving south to Finland and started doing the same thing across the Finnish border. So in 2015, there was almost 700 who came from Russia into Finland, and over 1,000 came in 2016, the first few months. And again, Finland was not prepared for this, and what was particularly disturbing was that a number of the asylum seekers died because it's the middle of winter, and they're trying to cross a border on a bicycle. It's not a good idea. So this was causing great concern. And it caused a huge scandal in Finland. The discussion was about, you know, what happens if this becomes the new route, as the Balkans were closed off. What happens if suddenly thousands and thousands of refugees start coming through Russia? What do we do? And then there was also a lot of discussions about, well, how did these refugees get there? And whether they were being trafficked by criminal gangs and involved in other criminal activities. So there was this also brought on a lot of anti-Russian discussion in Finland, that Russia was encouraging the migrants to come to Finland to hurt our society, and lots of things being discussed. It forced the president of Finland to organize a special meeting with President Putin. And President Putin at that meeting, there you have them, our President Sauli Niinistö. President Putin said that he would ask the border guards to stop the refugees crossing by bicycle. They also agreed that the border crossing in northern Finland, so this was all happening in Lapland, in the far north. They agreed that the border would be closed to everyone except citizens of Finland and Russia for 180 days, which made Swedes and Norwegians very angry, because they often crossed through Finland. After that meeting, almost immediately, all the refugees stopped crossing that way. So it took President Putin to intervene and make the border guards follow the procedures. There still are questions about why the Russian border guards were allowing these people to cross by bicycle when that should not have been allowed in the first place. But this little episode of a few months, about, 2,000 people, it was quite interesting from the Finnish perspective. I have colleagues right now who are going through all the interviews with the asylum seekers who crossed to Russia, and their stories are very, very interesting. Most have been living in Russia for many years. But that's somebody else's story, not mine. So, to finish, Finland as an example during this refugee crisis. It's a mixed story. It is not typical of one in the European Union. It is very much defined. It's economically weak. And it can't be used as a transit country. So anyone who thinks they might go from Finland through Sweden into Germany, they have several borders that are closed because of the collapse of Schengen. And as a result, this year we've had just 1,000 or so. So the government's position throughout the crisis has remained committed to the European position, the EU position. So it follows the rules, but it has made it so much more difficult for asylum seekers to get positive decisions in Finland. So, thank you very much.
Если у вас есть вопросы, вы можете их задать по-русски. По-русски, да. Потому что Пол прекрасно говорит по-русски. Вы можете на вопросы тоже ответить.
Да?
Thank you for your presentation. said that the first floor was with of migrants were Somalians people, yes?
The big groups, yes.
The big groups, it's strange and interesting. So how they integrated in your society and integrated fully, or they are infringed in some ways?
Okay. Why Somalis? It's because in 1990 that was the big crisis in the world.
Yeah.
So it could have been another country if it had been a different year. But that was the year. And since that time, that has meant that many Somalis have come to Finland. So they are really the largest group of migrants, refugees, migrants who are not neighbors. Somalis are not well integrated.
Isolated.
Finland, it's very difficult to say isolated. We don't really have ethnic neighborhoods, and especially those refugees coming, they get their apartment and it's mixed. They get an apartment from the state and they're mixed with Finns in other groups. But many have received citizenship. They speak Finnish. Of course, the children, they all speak, who are born there, they speak Finnish. They are integrated to some extent. But the statistics show that Somalis have poorer job prospects. Fewer go to university. There is the issue of women's equality. And that is very difficult in a Finnish context because Finnish women are very proud of having achieved quite a high degree of equality. And when they see Somali women restricted, they get very angry. So, are they isolated? Not exactly. They go, they get their training, they go to school, they participate in society. I don't think that they are concentrated in any job type. Perhaps in the bigger cities like Helsinki, there are many that are driving buses, like local transport drivers. But to say that they're fully integrated would be wrong. And there is racism. There is racism. We still do not have a member of parliament, a Somali member of parliament. We haven't had one. And this is now, over 20 years? It's taking a long time, but it's slowly happening. Еще вопросы?
Смелей. Хочется же спросить. Спрашивайте по-русски свободно.
У меня вопрос, не касающийся Европы.
Ага.
Вы сказали, что вы часто путешествуете в постсоветском пространстве, назвали Таджикистан и Грузию. Вы когда-нибудь в Туркменистане были?
Куда?
Туркменистан.
К сожалению, нет. Вот, это очень трудно получить визу.
А вы попробуйте, там очень красиво.
Наверное. Я слышал, да. Ну, несколько из моих коллег, они ездили на конференции. Да, но... Да, я не успел. Хочу, конечно, Ашхабад. Да, спасибо. Но я даже не успел ездить в Узбекистан. Это тоже тяжело.
А в Таджикистане были?
Где?
В Таджикистане.
Таджикистан, да.
Именно где?
Но летом я был в Баракшане, Хороги и Мургаб на севере. Но в Душанбе, но на севере всегда Худжанд, Панджакент, Кургантепа, неплохо, но к сожалению не успел ездить в долину Гар. Хочу. И, конечно, есть несколько городов, которые не было. Хорошая страна, красивая тоже.
Еще есть вопрос? Нет?
Это только для нас лекция была специально.
Но она потом будет выложена еще для тех, кто не попал на лекцию. Так что вам повезло, больше остальных. Спасибо. Тогда давайте поблагодарим профессора.
Спасибо за внимание. В Англии, в Кембридж. И во время аспирантуры, научная тема была современная ситуация, этнополитическая ситуация Республики Коми. Я жил в Коми.
А вы в Воркуте не были?
К сожалению, нет.
Приезжайте, там зимой красиво.
Да. Я слышал. Так, во время исследований в России, когда я жил в Коми, я ездил на конференцию, где была в Кудымкаре, Пермский край, да. И там я встретился с финнами, учеными. И, потом я собрался дать диссертацию, и я получил приглашение на проект от одного финна. И да, сразу я в Финляндии, в Хельсинки. И я 2,5 года работал на проекте. Проект про диаспору, Восточной Мариции. Я в 99 году первый раз был в Казани. И я, на севере и на востоке в республике я ездил много лет назад по деревьям. И там Пермская, Свердловская, Удмуртия, Башкортостан, Мариэл. Но после проекта потом я получил приглашение на постоянное место работы в университете в Йонсу. Это 500 километров на северо-востоке от Хельсинки, рядом границы с Карелией. Но это финская Карелия. Йонсу это как столица финской Карелии. И Петрозаводск это 300 километров от Йонсу. Граница полчаса. Так, приезжайте в Финляндию. Пожалуйста. Есть прямой рейс. В Хельсинки. Дешевле, да. Да. Это очень просто. Есть хорошие скорые поезды и много автобусов.
А вы сказали, что это не ваша тема. Какая тема ваша?
Но именно трудовая миграция из Средней Азии в Россию. И как мигранты здесь успеют интегрировать. И есть еще другие проекты тоже, но связаны с границей между Кыргызстаном и Таджикистаном. Но южный. Это Баракшан и не Ферганская долина. Это Но там красиво, я тоже там работал, но там сложно. И душно. Все.
Ну, если нет вопросов, то тогда заканчиваем. Спасибо.
Я вернусь. Весной я
Да,
вернусь.
спасибо.
Спасибо.